afternoon, Chris.
Good afternoon, Ahenya. And what brings us together in front of a microphone today?
We are now ranting around a very lesser known incident. Well, quote unquote incident. We might say that it was actually a massacre concerning a certain prisoners of war camp.
Actually, here in New Zealand.
Yes, exactly. The Featherston prisoners of war camp, which is located at the southeast of Wellington, North Island of New Zealand.
Now, this camp has a bit of a history of being it's been in the military for quite some time. It was initially established as a training camp for soldiers in World War One.
Yeah.
And after the war in the 1920s, it was dismantled. But then over time and as New Zealand was needed as a location to house prisoners of war from the Allied campaign in taking Guadalcanal and other areas in the Pacific Islands, it was brought back into existence as a prisoner of war camp and was hastily constructed to house 450 people or prisoners, which, needless to say, it rapidly and
became overflown by prisoners.
Yeah.
But where did these prisoners came from? On the Pacific campaign during the Second World War, the Allied forces launched the Operation Watchtower, in which they were pretty much going after the Japanese Imperium.
Mm-hmm. So most of this happened around the Solomon Islands and particularly in the offensive at Guadalcanal, which saw some pretty full-on intense fighting. And the US Army eventually recaptured the island and obviously took prisoners from the Japanese forces, including the Navy and the Japanese Army. They were spread out. The prisoners were divided between countries such as Australia and also New Zealand, which is the obvious focus of today's investigation.
The very first prisoners that were taken there, they were, of course, Japanese, but they didn't belong to the Japanese army, to be precise. There were more civilians that had been taken to the Solomon Islands in the intention of building, military...
military encampments and logistics. So effectively contractors.
Contractors, exactly.
Yeah, basically contractors. Who weren't soldiers and got caught up in the fighting, and as such were captured fairly quickly, as they weren't part of the military, the Japanese military.
Yeah. So the first prisoners to arrive to the Featherston prisoners of war camp arrived there on September 1942 after the final battle, the naval battle of Guadalcanal was won. And these people were no combatants, and they were pretty much, they submitted to the logic.
They weren't quite as indoctrinated as a lot of the other soldiers and seamen of the Japanese imperial forces, and as such were quite docile, one might say.
You could say in a nice way, because why would you have to be submitted to be a prisoner? But it's war logics.
Well, that as well as the ideology that was being enforced in the Japanese military, which was the...
Sankinkun.
Yes.
Which is instructions for the battlefield. Excuse us for our bad pronunciations because, Chris knows a bit of Japanese and I only know what I know from watching anime, so I don't really know much.
No, but this very fierce, sort of Bushido-esque battlefield ideology was brutally enforced by the officers on the lower-ranking soldiers, and as such, became the guiding ideology of, the whole death before dishonor, and that to be taken prisoner and not killed in the glory of battle in the name of the emperor was considered a spiritual death, and that the soldier could only be redeemed by finding death in rebellion against the captors.
Or in battle.
In battle.
Never lived to experience shame as a prisoner, reads the Sinkinkun. But the issue is that it only gave instructions of, like in the battlefield. I'm guessing it was more like a spiritual guide, like to enhance the spirits of the combatants, the warriors. But it gave little to no instructions of how to behave if you were a prisoner, because, well, they weren't expected to be taken prisoners.
No, that's absolutely right. And on that note as well, Japan was not a signatory to the Geneva Convention, which is fairly important in the events that occurred at Featherstone and the surrounding
downfall.
Well, the influence, the rippling effect that certain events had that led to the cause of the massacre.
Yeah. So first off, I was almost forgetting to acknowledge our main source, which is the Featherston's Chronicles, A Legacy of War, which was written by Mike Nicolaidi, Kiwi author who did a
Thorough.
Exactly. A very intense investigation on such incident, or like we say, such massacre. And did a very, basically went through the sea of official paperwork from the military. And I mean, not only the New Zealand one, but also the American correspondence, the British correspondence.
The Swiss correspondence.
Correspondence as well. And also had the chance to interview many of the officials, the guards, and even some of the Japanese prisoners that were kept in Featherston on the last century. So we were saying that the first prisoners to arrive were civilians, so they didn't, they submitted to the life in the prisoners of war camp, which it wasn't really bad at the beginning, so it was overpopulated. But all in all, the prisoners they had to do forced labor, of course, but they had free time. They had water and
food,
medicine, and such. On December of 1942, approximately 250 prisoners arrived, and they were all from the military of the Japanese Imperial Army, and 120 of them were Navy men from the water ship Furutaga, that had been sunk by the Americans at Guadalcanal. And this is where the frictions started to become more apparent, because the army men, and this is a thing, some of them took the words of the Sunhinkun very literally. They weren't happy about being prisoners, of course. They felt a sense of shame because they were receiving the food and they were sleeping in the beds of the enemy, so to speak. But what really angered them was the idea to being forced to do labor. They weren't sure about this. And when we look at the archives, it seems like the people in the Featherstone were just doing like a usual gardening, cleaning of the compounds, and some of them were making even furniture.
Yeah.
They were planning to build a factory furniture in there, just, I'm guessing, to keep the prisoners occupied until the conflict would end. But many of the military men, the Japanese prisoners of war, were very suspicious. They wouldn't work in any way that could benefit the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
There were 122 New Zealand soldiers that were deployed to guard the facility, and most of them were part from green reservists that weren't suitable for overseas
conflicts,
yep. Either because of their age or even
physical conditions, exactly. Slight, I guess you'd say, slight maladies that, while they were perfectly capable with, carrying out day-to-day duties, it sort of precluded them from taking part in major physical and rigorous military.
Yes, they weren't really ready to become the guards from prisoners. And this is something that Mike Nicolaides makes very clear in his book, that there was a particular hatred and also fear, also ignorance, particularly against the Japanese, because, Second World War was aimed to end with the Nazi regime. But, this is Nicolaides' opinion. And I think he's, I agree with his opinion. Like, perhaps the New Zealanders, the Kiwis, could relate a bit more, kind of, with the German enemies, because New Zealand is a colonized country. I mean, it's not a colony anymore. But, they could relate a bit more with an Occidental culture than with the Japanese culture that was completely very different.
Yeah, it was from a very different cultural background to theirs. And also at the time, there was quite a lot of effectively propaganda on all sides, but definitely in New Zealand and Australia, there was a lot of propaganda from the war ministries that was focusing on raising morale of the population by alienating and demonizing the Japanese. And if you look at some of it now, most people would be absolutely mortified and absolutely aghast at some of the incredibly racist and almost schoolyardish depictions and characterization of Japanese soldiers and Japanese culture, which again was there to reassure and bolster confidence and morale in the soldiers but mainly in the population as well. So a lot of people went into the military with an overinflated sense of superiority, I guess you could say, against the Japanese, but also that they were somehow to be looked down upon because they were from a different culture, but ethnicity as well, which was definitely something as well that played into the events that occurred at the Featherstone camp.
Not only the Japanese would follow the Sankinkun, like I said, but most of them were completely ignorant of the existence of the Geneva Convention. And that's actually something that we can put the responsibility on the Japanese government, to be fair, because what I read is that Japanese signed but didn't ratify.
Yes.
That's the word of the Geneva Convention, because the Japanese army pressured the government not to do so. Mm-hmm. So when they arrived to the camp, all these military veterans, many of them didn't even know about what their rights and obligations as prisoners were.
The fact that they, in theory, by law, the laws of war and the Geneva Convention, were assured safety and food and decent treatment. Obviously not 5-star treatment, but they were in theory meant to be provided with adequate accommodation, food, medicine, and to be not be treated as effective slaves, but however they were still prisoners and were allowed to be
forced to work.
Forced to work effectively.
That was the real issue.
Yeah.
When we look at the Featherston Chronicles, Mike Nicolaides got to interview a junior lieutenant that was in the Furutaka, Toshio Adachi, who was one of the older and fairly respectable authority within the camp. So when we read his version of the events, we found out that the more radicalized extremist people within the prisoners were actually very few. There were maybe 30. There was this group that was actually pushing to commit, that was pushing their officials to commit seppuku, that is
ritual suicide.
Ritual suicide, like
samurai.
Like samurais, exactly.
Who had been bested in combat, effectively, and that's how one mitigated the shame of defeat. Exactly. Was to ritually commit suicide usually by slicing into their own stomachs.
But actually, this old man that probably passed away by now, Adachi, he wasn't keen on that. He really understood that the Senhinkun he didn't take literally the words in the manual. So he was really trying to keep as many of his mates alive and trying to avoid conflict as far as possible. So it was Toshio Adachi and other Japanese officers that approached Lieutenant Colonel Donald Donaldson, whom was at that time the camp commandant in Featherston camp, basically telling him that, some of his men expected Adachi to kill himself and to show the character of a Japanese warrior, and he wasn't keen on that. So he was really trying to get some dialogue and get as very little people hurt afterwards. So after that, he actually managed to identify the extremists among the prisoners, and they were taken into a sort of suicide watch. Yeah, they were taken away from the compound number 2. So the first prisoners, the laborers, the ones that were more...
they were in number 1.
They were in number 1, and the war veterans were in compound number 2.
2, yeah.
So he says that he addressed the whole compound and asked those who wanted to commit ritual suicide to step up, and there were actually 30 of them, and they were taken into the suicide watch for a couple of weeks. And afterwards, they were taken back to the compound number 2. It seems like there were some of them that were also a bit hostile against the prisoners in the compound number 1. They would frown upon them.
Yep, they'd call out through the fence as the prisoners of compound 1 were marching off to work, their work consignments during the day, and would heckle them and say that they were being complicit with the enemy, and
they had been neglecting their Japanese character.
So already tensions were starting to mount between the prisoners themselves, which after a while, and the tensions sort of simmering, it all came to a head.
So on February 23rd, a Japanese prisoner of war stood on the barbed wire fence of the number 2 compound, and he screamed and yelled at the people in the compound number 1 to stop working. And oddly enough, they decided to join in a pacific protest, so they went back to the hatches. And this is when, the next day, we can see that the Kiwi military started messing up really bad. Because on the 24th, Lieutenant Adachi and his men woke up to discover that the colonel was asking them to double the regular number of prisoners to work on duty. They were asking them to give up 105 prisoners of war to work. And this was really a disciplinary measure that the Kiwis were taking against the Japanese.
In their defiance to not work in the previous days.
So Adachi asked for an interpreter because they had an interpreter. What they hadn't communicated to the whole of the camp was the Geneva Convention conditions for prisoners of war. So they had been asked also to work outside the camp, which was something completely unusual. And on the morning of the 25th of February 25th of 1943, the laborers in the compound number 1 began their usual
morning routine.
Meanwhile, the men in the compound number 2 just wouldn't get out of the huts. They were in complete rebellion.
Yeah.
I mean, not sure if...
Well, revolt, I guess.
But the thing is that the word revolt sometimes implies a violent action. And what they were trying to do was a sit-in.
Yes. Well, they effectively embarking on a campaign of civil disobedience. Although I don't know if you can call this military disobedience.
Exactly. So Toshio and Nishimura, another lieutenant from the same ship, asked for a meeting with Donaldson once again, since he had been kind of diplomatic with them, but Donaldson stayed in his office. In his place, the camp adjutant,
which is
lieutenant,
effectively the supervisor.
So instead, the Lieutenant James Malcolm, the camp adjutant, was sent to talk to Nishimura and Toshio Adachi. This is where the stories began. The different versions of the Featherston Massacre start to come out, because according to the story of Adachi, after trying to negotiate with Malcolm to have a meeting with Donaldson, what Malcolm decided to do was to take Nishimura by the force. He asked 2 guards that were unarmed, these people were unarmed, to take Nishimura away. And in this raffle, a Japanese prisoner of war was actually
bayoneted
in a leg, and according to the Japanese version, he accidentally got his fingers cut off because he
was clasping the bayonet as it was being removed.
Exactly.
And which, it actually managed to sever all of his fingers. All of his fingers as he was clutching it.
Although in the official
New Zealand version of events,
this didn't happen, but there is a politely found in the hospital records that some prisoner of war was taken to the hospital because he was injured by a bayonet in that very same day. So I am guessing that this is not a coincidence at all. So we had at this point 240 prisoners that were either sit or squatting close together in a quadrangular area between the completed huts and the southeast end of the compound. And there was an old concrete foundation in which there was some sort of podium from which Malcolm and the translators, Captain Alexander Ashton and Lieutenant John Thomas, were addressing the prisoners. So the Japanese have already seen that Nishimura had been taken by the force, and allegedly that a prisoner had been stabbed with a bayonet, yet they kept sit in their place. This is what happened following. So I was saying that the prisoners were doing a sitting, properly speaking, between the huts. In the meantime, I think it was Malcolm who had ordered a couple
of the guards,
46
guards,
to take a position basically surrounding from all sides to the...
Yeah, there were several guards stationed on various roofs.
7 of them had taken places in the roofs of the latrines, so they were above all of the rest.
Most of the guards were armed with rifles. However, there were several, including one guard in particular, who were armed under orders with automatic Thompson machine guns or Tommy guns.
James Malcolm would say to a court of inquiry a month later, quote, "I decided upon a show of arms as my next move, there being no remaining expedient apparent to me to get over the situation." So what Malcolm says is that he took a revolver from another guard and he allegedly shot a warning shot just above the head of Adachi, the Japanese. He claimed that the Japanese prisoner stood in the same place, so he decided to shoot Adachi in a shoulder, injuring him. And this was perhaps the biggest mistake he could have done, because according to what Adachi would say afterwards, and also according some Kiwi guards that were interviewed by Knight Nicolaidi, there wasn't such warning sight. They claim that Malcolm shot Adachi straight away in the arm with such bad luck that the bullet passed through his arm and actually impact on the head of a prisoner that was just behind him, killing him instantly, indeed. So, seeing that an authority, Adachi, had been shot, it seems like a prisoner had been killed, perhaps accidentally in a negligent way. The prisoners started to roar, and according to what the official version of the Kiwis, they ran en masse to the guards. And this is when a guard called Jack Owen, who was one of the ones that was on the latrine roofs with a Tommy gun, nonetheless started to shoot spontaneously without receiving any order to fire. And unsurprisingly, many of the other guards easily joined in the shooting. It took between 15 to 30 seconds after being told to stop the fire several times by Malcolm and other officers, that, they definitely stopped shooting. In that moment, 31 Japanese prisoners died instantly and another 92 were wounded, 17 of whom would die in the coming days. And even 10 Kiwi guards were injured, and one of them, Pelvin, received a bullet in his own back, and he was the only the only Kiwi to die on that day. So that really tells how
just the wild firing into the crowd that was going on, where they weren't even aware of ricochet and crossfire into their own fellow soldiers.
Exactly. And Len James, a military veteran that was also interviewed by Nicolaidi, and several others would have told him that they saw guard that was, how do you say, trigger happy?
Trigger happy, yeah, definitely trigger happy.
And this was nonetheless but Jack Owen. So, could you explain the listener what trigger happy means, Chris?
Well, trigger happy is effectively a term to describe someone who's eagerly or over-eager and somewhat bloodthirsty. So they were effectively looking for an excuse to mow someone down or shoot someone, effectively.
So Eric Thompson, a retired civil engineer and a former Army intelligence officer, was also on that day on Featherston and was as well approached by Nicolaidi in his book, and he pretty much was one of the first people to actually acknowledge the fact that there wasn't a warning shoot from James Malcolm. And I'm going to quote the book. Eric also speaks of the New Zealanders' overall lack of understanding of the Japanese way of thinking. He says, "One can only think the New Zealand side blundered into the incident without really knowing what the outcome was going to be. For one thing, it thought it could threaten the Japanese with death. Now the Japanese, being prisoners of war, have been through a psychological process for several months, during which to be threatened with death by having a man aim a pistol at you was just a laugh. They would think, well, this is at last, here is my fate, which I deserve."
Mm-hmm.
So if Malcolm thought that threatening the prisoners with a gun was going to be a good idea, it turned out to be exactly the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like we say, there were very few prisoners that were really keen on doing a heroic death in the camp. Nishimura and Adachi were really looking forward finding the most
civil outcome.
But they just wouldn't work for the enemy. And then we have the aftermath of the shooting incident.
Firstly, after the incident, the Red Cross were allowed on the camp to conduct an investigation, and their initial outcome was that they found that Owen had fired most of the bullets that had caused a lot of the carnage, and that even though it was allegedly in retaliation and an act of emergency, the ferocity and bloodlust of the firing squad of the guards was excessive and went on for a lot longer than it needed to retain order or safety of the guards on the ground.
So an official investigation was done shortly after a month. So according to the official report, it was dubbed an incident that they used extreme force, but it really makes it look like
the actions were warranted under the circumstance, as the prisoners were about to riot and take control of the camp and possibly get hold of some weapons and overrun the...
I mean, actually, Adachi was about to get, how would you say, sued? I don't know if that's the word, but at some point there was this report in which Adachi was going to be investigated for starting a mutiny shortly after the incident. And this is curious, it was even Donaldson who testified in favor of Adachi, saying that he had always been very reasonable with him. So you see, the government of New Zealand really tried to push the idea that it was going to be a mutiny, and that was really much more like a gossip within the same camp, because they had this issue with the suicide squad, if you wish, and perhaps there were few prisoners. They were the youngest. They were petty officers, Japanese officers that wanted to go through with that. At some point, yes, there was this rumor that they were going to try to steal guns from the very same camp and then continue the warfare in New Zealand land, but this was it never happened. And also, when the inquiry was done and when they were searching the bodies of the prisoners, the Japanese prisoners that were dead, they could only find their tools, their working tools. They didn't have any sort of weapon at all aside from a rock or a hammer. And if we consider that they were probably going to be forced to labor, it's not a surprise that they had their own tools with them, really.
It should also be pointed out that a lot of the evidence and the report was heavily modified and overwritten by the British Army, and not just the New Zealand Army, wanting to suppress reports of a wartime home soil effective massacre, which was important to keeping the morale and the wartime enmity at a hype against the enemy. The last thing they would want is the local peoples to develop any form of sympathy towards their wartime enemy.
Yeah, they were also afraid perhaps of some sort of retaliation from the Japanese government. The Prime Minister of New Zealand, Peter Fraser, in his first public statement to New Zealanders on the shooting on the 1st of March of 1943, said, quote, "The unfortunate results of the incidents are to be regretted, but in the circumstances, firm action on the part of the guards was necessary to quell the riot and restore order." But according to a Red Cross investigation that was done, it is now that we know that it was actually Jack Owen, the one that shot the most.
And the fact that he did have a automatic machine gun, we had a machine gun, that was set to automatic, whereas other soldiers, other guards who were also armed with the Thompson machine guns, actually had them set to single shot. And Owen didn't just come to this bloodthirsty conclusion for no reason.
It looks that he might actually had a personal reason to hate the Japanese, indeed.
Yeah, and
why? We are not justifying. We're not condemning this.
The reason Jack Owen was holding such a grudge against the Japanese is because in the previous year, on October the 15th, his brother, Charles Owen, was beheaded by the Japanese military, and alongside with 21 other prisoners of war in the small island of
Tarawa.
Tarawa. They were kept as prisoners during the push along...
Private Charles Owen was one of 14 New Zealand Army personnel who had been volunteered to assist 10 New Zealand Post and Telegraph Department radio operations in the islands of Kiribati at the northwest of Fiji in early 1941. So the Coast Watchers were actually there before the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese army and the official outbreak of the Pacific War on December 1941. Private Owen had been captured and had been kept in a lunatic asylum. The execution of him and his other 22 mates was basically a retaliation for the attacks that the U.S. Army was perpetrating around that area during October of 1942. And since Japan didn't oblige to the Geneva Convention of War, they took the liberty to, take these prisoners and decapitate them. And there were actually 3 witnesses of such execution, an Icelander from the Tarawa Island and 2 French missionaries that were around. It is hard to tell whether Jack Owen knew if his brother was dead by the time he was on Featherston, but by the end of the year they knew that this Kiwi army man, this Coast Guard, had been captured by the Japanese.
While it's not clear, it is theorized, it is believed that it's quite possible that he did know, as information had been trickling back over time as servicemen were returning for R&R or coming back injured, and during their recuperation were passing on information about various other servicemen and family members and it was disseminating back into the public, in this case, back to Jack Owen, which would go some way to explaining his absolute loathing and bloodlust when it came to... as the bodies of the deceased from the Featherstone incident, the Japanese were incinerated, cremated, and to this day it's not known where the cremated remains are.
So there are official documents that indicate that they were taken in the same ship where the prisoners of war were taken once the war was over. But there were also some rumors that they might have been buried in the very same ground. And there were rumors also that the same bodies and not the ashes were buried in Featherston. But there's also, it is registered that these people were taken and cremated in a crematorium near Wellington. So perhaps it's safe to say that they were cremated, but it's not 100% sure if they were really returned to Japan. We may never know what happened. And to be fair, the same with the 22 Kiwis that were killed in the Tarawa Island. One of them was Charles Owen. Those bodies were never recovered as well. And yet, Adachi went back to New Zealand 3 times after the war was over. In one occasion, it was in 1986, in which he took part of a religious ceremony in remembrance of those who were killed there. So, guess we could say he doesn't have any hard feelings against the Kiwis after all.
Or at least he acknowledges that the events that happen in war are an extreme side of humanity and don't necessarily reflect on the whole of a population of a country or a people outside of wartime, and that while certain events and people might not be forgiven, that as part of his own healing process, you could say that he remembers the events, but in some form does partially forgive the people of New Zealand for the events that occurred in the country during the war.
And all that is left nowadays in remembrance of the Japanese prisoners that were killed, it's a small group of cherry trees. And at the entrance of the group is a small plaque, and on it it's written the translation of a 17th century haiku by Matsuo Basho that says, "Behold the summer grass, all that remains of the dreams of warriors." We have to say that New Zealand never took any sort of, I don't know if to use the word punishment for such a massacre. That's why when you look it up in the internet, you're mostly going to find it as the Featherstone incident.
I think mainly to save face, or to not cause a massive international outcry and bring down the Geneva Convention on New Zealand for war crimes, that the New Zealand and definitely the British military had to do a lot of fancy creative paperwork and interview coaching of the involved military to not make the incident as serious as it actually was, and to absolutely downplay it, and that effectively all of the people involved were utterly sworn to secrecy, and many of them carried the knowledge and the trauma of what really happened, several of whom did speak out in the end, some of whom made deathbed confessions, and others who ended up taking it to their graves. Although it's said that they never forgot what happened and it did haunt them. and definitely, although at the time wasn't known to their friends and family, that it absolutely left an indelible mark on their lives that contributed to a lot of their behaviour.
So, where can our listeners find us on the social media, Chris?
Well, we are all over the internet. We have presence on Spotify, on YouTube. We've got a Facebook page. We're on Instagram. We're on Twitter.
We have an email, ahistoryofelvilmen@gmail.com.
Yeah. And where else can they find us?
We have a Patreon profile.
That's right.
Patreon.com/ahistoryofelvilmen.
Mm-hmm. And if you look for us on various other platforms for podcasts, you should be able to find us. And once again, we shall leave you with the beautiful tones provided to us by Steph Animal.